Well, again, good morning, everyone. It is so good to have you with us. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for what we are excited to share today, an update on North Carolina's Preschool Development Grant Needs Assessment for the PDG Birth Through 5 grant. My name is Dan Worry. I'm the Senior Director of Early Learning at the Hunt Institute, which is located in Cary, North Carolina, and likely for a North Carolina crowd, needs a little more introduction than that, but for those of you who may be unfamiliar, the Institute is the brainchild of Jim Hunt, who was the four-term governor of North Carolina. We are an education policy support to the nation's governors and state lawmakers primarily, and it has been our privilege over the past year and a half or so to partner with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services and our colleagues at Duke University's Center for Child and Family Policy, which is part of the Sanford School of Public Policy, on an update to North Carolina's needs assessment. I'll give a little more context here in just a moment, but want to first turn things over to our friend and colleague, Teresa Bronisheimer, who is joining us from North Carolina DHHS to offer a few words of welcome. Teresa.
Hi, good morning. Thank you all for having me. I'm so glad that I could be here today with you all. This is an exciting time for us in North Carolina, especially at the division, with this needs assessment, this opportunity has been very enlightening to us. And so with the preschool development grant, it was a requirement that we do a needs assessment in our planning grant period. And then we've had the opportunity to update that needs assessment. So this wonderful work that the Hunt Institute and Duke has done has already been making changes in the way that we provide services here in North Carolina. So with further ado, I'm just, again, so thankful for this team and thankful for this opportunity to share with all of you all here in North Carolina about the amazing work that we've been doing, but not just that, just really a great understanding of what our needs are for our children, families, and our childcare workforce. So thank you all so much.
Teresa, thank you so much. And as we get started here, just a little bit of context about the preschool development grants, because in reality, you may know, the federal government has funded two such things. In 2014, the original preschool development grants federally were designed to expand pre-kindergarten in the states in particular as sort of an offshoot from what you may remember was called the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grants at the time. That was 2014. This, though, is the Preschool Development Grant Birth Through 5, which was issued originally in 2018 by the federal government. And as its name, the Birth Through 5 portion would indicate, this is a little different focus. It is not focused exclusively on four-year-old pre-kindergarten, for example, but really at strengthening states' mixed delivery systems for all children from birth through 5. One of the things that is unique about the PDG grants nationally is that they are especially data-driven. And so as the states, and incidentally, most states, did receive at least a year one planning grant in the PDG Birth Through 5 process. But the requirement from the federal government during that initial planning process was really sort of a strategic planning process for the systems. And it began with, as a first step, a requirement that states conduct a really thorough needs and resources assessment to look at what's happening in the state and where there may be gaps for children and families and within the service provision system in the state. So North Carolina was awarded an initial preschool development grant, Birth Through 5, in 2018. And it was in February of 2020 that our friends and colleagues at the Frank Porter Graham Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill released the state's first preschool development grant needs assessment. And I want to circle you back for just a moment to that date, February of 2020. Which was, as you may recall, thinking back to that time, literally just weeks before the world sort of turned on its axis and the pandemic sort of swept over the country in March of 2020. And so we had this amazing sort of real-time look at how things were going in North Carolina. And then the world changed very dramatically. And so as part of an extended opportunity for the state of North Carolina, this preschool development grant needs or update that our colleagues put together is an opportunity to look again sort of at real time now, and how did the state adapt and how did providers and children and families fare during the pandemic in particular. It has been our treat at the Hunt Institute to help to lead this work, again, in partnership with our great colleagues at the Center for Child and Family Policy. I want to introduce you to my colleague, Emily Chavis, who is a policy analyst at the Hunt Institute, and Doctors Liz Snyder-Fickler and Nicole Lawrence, who are both with the Center for Child and Family Policy at Duke. Emily, Liz, and Nicole were certainly huge leaders on this project over the past 18 months, alongside our former colleague, Karen McKnight. And so we are going to walk you through today sort of a high-level summary of the findings of this updated needs assessment. We'll save a couple minutes at the end of the hour for your questions, and we'll moderate through those. As an FYI, because of the format of this webinar, if you have questions, want to encourage you to insert them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, rather than using the chat. You'll see in some cases in these webinars, the chat moves very quickly and questions can be easily lost. So if you will plug those into the Q&A, then we'll be ready to try to take a look at those as time permits at the end of the hour. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Emily Chavis, to begin our presentation.
Thanks so much, Dan. As Dan mentioned, my name's Emily Chavis, policy analyst on the early learning team, and I had the pleasure of working on this needs assessment with Duke. And the first part of this needs assessment, we conducted a literature review of multiple data sources. And we looked at the data that was used in the initial needs assessment to try and find updated information on those sources. It was a bit difficult at the time because of COVID, data collection stopped for a lot of these data points that were in the initial needs assessment. So for some of the data points, we looked at national data that had been updated and tried to use that to compare to the North Carolina perspective. And we also did interviews with state leaders in North Carolina, and I let Nicole go more into the focus group process and the interview process.
Sure. Thanks, Emily. So we facilitated some focus groups in January and February of 2022. And really the purpose of those focus groups that we did with families and providers was to sort of build on the listening sessions and interviews that had been conducted in the initial needs assessment that Dan referred to earlier with our friends at UNC. But with a special focus on some populations that were less represented or had less voice in that initial needs assessment. And importantly, as Dan mentioned, COVID, the pandemic was not a significant factor when UNC did the original needs assessment. So this also provided a unique opportunity for us to better understand what the sort of systemic challenges were both before and after the pandemic, but importantly, from the perspective of those that were most impacted, again, families and providers, and involved in the early childhood education system or network in North Carolina. So essentially, we did a random stratified sample that included 21 counties. We selected those 21 counties with the idea that we wanted to have diversity across the state, in terms of rural and urban communities, but also we wanted to have some tribal communities represented, as well as communities that have large military installations, which everyone in North Carolina knows is a big part of our state. And also we wanted to include the voice of monolingual Spanish speakers. So we worked to do that as well. We did 18 focus groups, 10 with parents, 8 with providers, and that included family childcare providers, centers, Head Start, you name it, every type of childcare operation we tried to include. We had 92 parents in total, and they were separated out by the sort or type of care that they use. And 72 providers participated, again, sorted by the type of care that they provide. Also, Emily mentioned that we did interviews with stakeholders, state level and local administrators. So we did 17 separate interviews with 13 different organizations that included 60 different folks that were actually participating in those interviews. So I'll pass it back to Emily. I think she's up next.
Thanks, Nicole.
Sure.
So these were the themes that we followed in the needs assessment update. These were the themes that were included in the initial needs assessment, and they also followed the early childhood action plan. As a result of what we heard in the focus groups, we ended up adding 2 new sections. So we created a sole section on the early care and learning workforce, because workforce was so prevalent in our focus groups and also our interviews. And the pandemic really highlighted the impact it had on the workforce. And we also included a section on COVID because COVID was new and obviously was not going on during the time of the initial needs assessment. And it was so prevalent in all of our focus groups and our interviews, and even our data collection as well for data that was updated. COVID had an impact on those numbers as well. And so I'm going to go into the COVID-19 section. So as we know, the early care and learning field there was a lot of issues already going on that the pandemic highlighted. So a lot of these issues that we saw in the field were not new. The pandemic just showed the need for resources to address these issues and continue to highlight them. But not everything that COVID highlighted was negative. We also saw some positives that came from it. So increased coordination and collaboration efforts across different agencies and different networks. The use of telecommunications such as Zoom and things like that allowed for more collaboration, and also the needs that were highlighted during the pandemic showed a need for more collaboration and coordination across agencies. There was also federal relief funding that was given to states that also helped with some of these issues that we saw in the early care and learning field. And we'll continue to talk about that in the workforce section. But the pandemic also created, it also emphasized the lack of access to childcare that some families go through. And also, we talk about stabilization grants, which is a part of that federal relief funding, and I'll continue to talk about that in the workforce session. But we heard from providers and families that they share concerns with the loss of funding or the funding cliff as a result of these relief funding ending. These were some of the quotes that we heard. These are just like some that we pulled out from the report. In the actual needs assessment update report, we have all of the quotes that were transcribed in the appendix. So you can also go through that report and see some more quotes, but these were some that really stuck out to us. So these are from the provider focus groups, and you can see how providers were really feeling the impacts of COVID during this time. And you could hear that in those focus groups. And it was really challenging for some providers. We heard about providers having to retire earlier than they expected because of concerns about being in the centers with COVID outbreaks. Also, the stress on providers as well was very significant during this time. Finding, which I'll continue to talk about in the workforce session, but also finding staff for centers was very difficult during this time because it required more work or effort from providers during this time because of like the increased need for precautions and things around decreasing COVID outbreaks in centers. And then we hear from the parent focus groups. So parents had a very difficult time during this period as well. And I also want to highlight that this was during the, I think it was the Omicron outbreak was going on at this time as well. So we were hearing firsthand, it was like we were going through this initial pandemic process all over again. So we were hearing firsthand from families and providers about what was happening at the moment with the pandemic impacts. So we heard from some families who of limited spots in childcare centers. Like at this one quote shows where a family had to get to a center at 6:30 in the morning, and even though they were there that early, they still didn't have a spot for their child. So that day they didn't have childcare for their child, and so it created a lot of stress for families. We also heard about teacher turnover concerns parents had with the change in teachers. We heard from one parent about how they would take their child to childcare and then it would be a different teacher each time that they showed up. And they were concerned about how that might have an impact on their child's development because they can't create these relationships with those that are giving them care. And so these are some considerations for strategic planning that came out of some of the focus groups in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that it had on the early care field. So continued coordination, collaboration efforts across agencies. And we continue to see that with the Early Childhood Advisory Council and the Birth to Third Grade Interagency Council. Implement technology support. So we also heard about how some providers were really appreciated the ability to be able to submit things electronically or being able to do trainings and things like that electronically, made it easier and easier to access these. So being able to continue to use technology in that way. Increased public investment, as we saw with the federal relief funding, the impact that it had on the field, and continuing that funding and finding ways to continue that. And so now we're going to go into the workforce. As I mentioned earlier, stabilization grants were they were being released as we were doing the focus group, so we weren't able to really include the impact of the grants data-wise, but we were able to, like numbers-wise, but we were able to hear from providers in the focus groups about how those stabilization grants were so crucial to the field and so crucial to keeping providers in centers and also recruiting new providers because they were able to offer more incentives for providers in the field. But as we know, and as I mentioned earlier, the funding cliff is a concern, and how do we keep providers in the centers when these funds end? And so that was also a big concern that we heard from providers in our focus group. So this is a data that we found on the staffing as a result of the pandemic and how staffing decreased at the beginning of the pandemic significantly. But as you can see with the yellow line, that's when stabilization grants started to go out. And we see that as stabilization grants went out, the staffing numbers started to increase. And that goes to show, like, the numbers are showing what providers were saying in the focus groups, and how crucial, like, these funding, like this relief funding was for the field. This was a quote from provider focus group participant talking about how COVID really magnified some of these issues in the field. And so the lack of competitive pay for providers. We also heard in some of the Head Start focus groups losing staff members to the K-12 system, because the K-12 system can offer better benefits and better pay. And so if a provider is qualified and has these a bachelor's degree or things like that, then it made more sense for them to go into K-12 system so that they can get better pay and better benefits. So centers were losing providers to the K-12 school system and things like that. And so providers were having a hard time finding people to come into the centers. We heard from some providers in the focus groups about struggle with recruiting teachers in centers, and also having to basically worried that a teacher would leave the next week or so because of, like, stress or just all of these new requirements that were happening, and just trying to continue to find people to fill those spots. These are some quotes from the parent focus groups. And parents were concerned with the quality of care that their children were receiving during this time because of, as I mentioned, the high turnover rate, having to recruit new teachers every so often or every week, the changing in teachers and things like that. So parents were really concerned about the impact that the turnover rates had on their child's development. So these were some considerations for strategic planning that came out of these focus groups in relation to the workforce. And so, of course, exploring long-term strategies and including public investment to address low wages and benefits for early childhood professionals, but also continue evaluating programs such as wages and awards. Also increasing the pathways, like building and expanding primary set of pathways for providers to enter the field of early childhood education, and making it a sustainable field for providers to continue and to want to go into that field. And also hearing from providers. We heard a lot of positive feedback from providers feeling like they're being listened to, and to continue that stakeholder engagement process, and using this to influence policies in the future, and to continue to involve providers in future and ongoing policies as well. And I will turn it over to Liz to talk about high quality early care and learning.
Thank you, Emily. So in terms of a high-level summary of our findings on high-quality early care and learning, taken from administrative data for the state, the stakeholder interviews that Nicole mentioned, as well as our focus groups, we really found that enrollment in childcare, similar to the number of teachers, really declined throughout the pandemic, but similarly did start to rebound after those stabilization grants began in November of 2021. We heard a lot from families regarding disparities in access to high quality care. This was also supported by the administrative data. So it's particularly true for families of color, those living in rural areas, those with tribal affiliation, and especially those with infants and toddlers. As many folks already know, the market rate truly fails to represent the cost of care, especially for infants and toddlers. There are long wait lists for child care subsidy, meaning many families who need care are unable to access it. And lastly, the star rating system does play a role when families are evaluating and choosing their care options, which does lead to an increase and improved quality. Within this graph, you can see that consistent with the data that Emily showed earlier, the number of children enrolled in early childhood care and education decreased quite significantly from February 2020 to February 2022. And this also corresponds with the significant drop in early childhood education sites across the state from February 20 to 2022. Within our provider focus groups, center-based staff in particular voiced significant concerns about being able to maintain their star rating, given the staffing challenges that they face and that Emily just described. You can see this here highlighted in a quote from one of our provider focus groups. A lot of concern that particularly around the education level of their staff as to whether or not they'd be able to maintain their star rating. Consistent with that, many participants were pleased with the freezing of the education requirement for maintaining star ratings and thought that might give them some breathing room. But also it really kind of opened up suggestions and thoughts about reevaluating the star rating system in North Carolina and how we might be able to incorporate more qualitative input from staff, from parents and directors as to what constitutes high quality, and perhaps really getting more of that teacher and parent voice in those ratings. Within our family focus groups, the most pressing topic was really related to access to high quality care. So for our parents, most often noted concerns around cost, availability of slots, lots of wait lists, particularly in rural communities, concerns around subsidies, as well as hours of operation. And you can kind of see this through a variety of quotes from our parent focus groups across the state, rural and urban, regardless of the type of care used. These concerns were really pressing for all parents. A lot of parents suggested that high quality private care was just too expensive and that public programs were extremely hard to get into. And apart from the cost associated with the high quality care, finding care, just any care, was a real challenge for a lot of our families. And they indicated this was a challenge before the pandemic. It just became even more pronounced during the pandemic. We had parents describing being on multiple wait lists at different centers, particularly if they had children of different ages. Many families having a hard time finding care that could take all their children. And a lot of parents were really concerned that the access that they had gained through subsidies through the CARES Act, that once that money went away, that they would no longer be able to access their current care. So a lot of concerns there as well. With respect to considerations for strategic planning related to high quality care, the first one is to expand access to subsidized child care programs at a rate in alignment with the true cost of care. It's also suggested to enhance data systems to better collect information on the number of children served in early care and learning programs, those who are waiting to access care, the workforce within early childhood care and education, including demographic information, geographic location, the languages of families they serve, et cetera, that this would really help the state get a better handle on where deserts might exist and those waiting to access care. It's also suggested to conduct a study and a stakeholder engagement process to better understand barriers and opportunities for family childcare home providers, and really maintaining but also expanding their participation in North Carolina's mixed delivery system. And lastly, to analyze the star-rated license system through an equity lens, ensuring that it's strength-based, focusing on improvement, and considering some additional qualitative factors to add in as well. With respect to on track for school success, what we found was that families want their children ready for kindergarten, and they understand that that requires both social and emotional skills as well as academic skills. North Carolina has created a standardized process of transition from preschool to kindergarten. However, the expansion to all program types and analysis of impact are necessary to determine how well it's working and possible improvements. The pandemic also had an impact on families' ability to access early intervention services and special education services for those 0 to 4. And cultural competency among early childhood educators still remains a challenge. Within this graph, you can see the decrease in the number of children served by Part C, which is for children 0 to 3 who might need early intervention services, and particularly those needing Part B services, which are those preschool services for 4-year-olds, 3 and 4-year-olds. That really decreased significantly from 2019 to 2020. And obviously, this could have significant impacts on children's readiness for kindergarten, as well as their long-term academic success. Providers from our NC Pre-K, Head Start, and rural private center groups discussed some implementation of really robust kindergarten readiness and transition practices. That's highlighted here in this quote from one of our providers in a rural center-based location. Many also mentioned how they involve parents in this process by sharing results from developmental assessments, holding transition meetings, and sending work home, particularly those in NC Pre-K and Head Start, sending work home over the summer to keep those skills up. And those that are located within K through 12 settings really described very robust transition meetings with kindergarten teachers and other staff from the K through 12 schools. And this really, they really felt this helped to enhance a smooth transition for those children. Providers also discussed the importance of social emotional skills as a foundation for readiness, but really felt that that parents were more focused on academic skills. As I mentioned earlier, and you'll see in the next slide, we heard from parents the importance of social emotional skills. So there may be an opportunity for better communication and collaboration between parents and teachers on that part. Another thing we heard in our provider focus groups was a disconnect between what many consider developmentally appropriate practices for children in that preschool age range and what the kindergarten entry standards are today. That there's a big gap there and a lot of pressure to increase what's happening in their early childhood settings to meet that, but whether or not that's truly developmentally appropriate. And we heard from a lot of providers about a request or a need for universal communication that might be able to come from the state around what beginning of year kindergarten standards are, as well as the importance of social emotional skills for kindergarten readiness. So being able to send that messaging out to all providers as well as all parents so that everybody can be on the same page. So these are some quotes from our parent focus groups and really kind of encapsulate a lot of what we heard regarding school readiness. So in addition to social and emotional skills, parents across all provider types and all areas of the state offered a number of key things they believe to be important to ensuring children's readiness for kindergarten. And the areas most often noted by parents included mastery of basic academics, as well as social and emotional skills, but also some defined program standards and a process for tracking child progress over time. So many parents felt like they may not be getting all the information they need about how their child is progressing and how ready they are for kindergarten, whether they're meeting their developmental milestones, and the importance of developing daily routines. So again, maybe some opportunity there for collaboration among parents and teachers to best support these transition practices and to understand what's happening in the classroom and how they can support those practices at home. With respect to considerations for strategic planning, one is continued alignment and implementation of kindergarten transition practices across all program types. So trying to establish some universal protocols and procedures. Another important topic is providing professional development on differentiating instruction for children with disabilities and improving coordination and collaboration between early childhood care and education programs and the public schools to ensure that children with disabilities are best served in inclusive classroom settings. And also importantly, continued efforts to support parent knowledge and engagement in their children's development and learning, particularly in the transition from early intervention services to Part B preschool education and into kindergarten. And this could be accomplished through parenting education, family support services, as well as some TA and training for early childhood educators on how to best engage families in these processes. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Nicole Lawrence.
Hello. So I'm going to sort of take this presentation home with the last two sections of the report, the next one being social, emotional health and resilience. And I think as Emily noted earlier, data specific to North Carolina were not available with regard to the impact of the pandemic on children's social and emotional development. However, within the needs assessment report, we do highlight some national data. That said, we did learn a lot and got some really important key takeaways from both parents and providers through the focus groups. And what we heard from those groups is that increased parent and provider stress is really going to require some additional mental health supports and services across our state to address these issues. We also heard that challenging behaviors had really increased and heightened during the pandemic, and that the needs of families and early educators were heightened, and that access to resources to address some of these mental health and behavioral needs were paramount. We also heard that programs across the state really vary on the use of social emotional curricula, but also assessments, which just highlighted a need for something more comprehensive provider supports around developmentally appropriate practices, but also mechanisms for measuring these things. So some of the things that we heard from providers in the focus group, well, importantly, across all of the focus groups, we heard from providers that children's behavioral and emotional health had suffered tremendously during the pandemic. And teachers really felt that it was negatively impacting both the classroom environment, but also them personally, that some of those challenges were really having an impact on teachers, which might also have contributed to some of the turnover. Providers across types of settings indicated that they would really like more training and professional development and other supports on how to manage some of these behavioral challenges in the classroom. And I did notice in this chat, someone asked a question about, expulsion issues, and a number of providers indicated feeling very distressed when children had to leave programs because of unmanageable behavioral issues, sort of describing that as leaving them wondering what they could have done differently. Were there strategies they could have used that might have avoided, that child ultimately not being able to be served in that environment anymore? And a lot of providers indicated that resources around this were pretty far and few between, especially in rural communities. We did hear from NC Pre-K and Head Start teachers that there was access to mental health specialists for this very need, but because of the pandemic, the need had increased and access to that ultimately was decreased, just because the numbers were greater and the need was greater. So it resulted in increased wait times, is how a lot of them described that. What we heard from parents across the different types of care that they use was that one of the most common themes was that parents wanted their children to acquire social and emotional skills, which is sort of what Liz was alluding to earlier, in the sense that providers thought maybe parents didn't recognize the importance of that. But we heard that over and over and over again from parents. Specifically, parents mentioned that they wanted their children to be well-adjusted socially, and to develop the social and emotional skills that they knew that they would need for that transition to kindergarten that Liz just talked about. Exposure to different cultures was also noted and thought of by parents as sort of a building block for social emotional skills and that transition to kindergartens. That was also something that we heard, and you can see that's reflected in the quotes, on the screen. So when we think about some considerations for strategic planning, and for the sake of time, I won't go through all of these, but I'll just highlight, so we want to be sure and have time at the end to answer some of your questions. But to collect and share comprehensive data on the social and emotional health and resilience of young children in North Carolina, and this, based on some of the recommendations from the social emotional health data work group that is active, I believe, still now. Increasing access to social and emotional health and resilience supports with expanding strategies for addressing the challenging behaviors for early childhood educators and the families they serve. And then importantly, making instructional resources and curricula on social emotional development more available and accessible to early childhood educators across different program types and regardless of where they're located, across the state. The next section I'll run through again in the interest of time was supportive and supported families and communities. So what we heard loud and clear, both from providers and parents, was that families in North Carolina during the pandemic were really struggling to cover a lot of sort of household kind of living expenses, rent, food, childcare. These were all expenses that families were really struggling to cover during the time that we talked to them. Services are needed and necessary to support the needs of Spanish-speaking families that are experiencing instability in housing, and also serving the unique needs of tribal populations and communities. And then the Family Engagement and Leadership Coalition created a framework that could be used by providers to meaningfully and appropriately bring families to the table and engage them in child development. And then family engagement policies and practices remain pretty inconsistent across the state. I mean, we know that within Head Start and NC Pre-K, those structures are a little bit more consistent, but within other types of care settings, there was less consistency and a need for greater direction that way. So some of the specific things that we heard in the parent focus groups were, and you can see here the Spanish speaking, if they could offer free English lessons to mothers, things like that were the sorts of supports and services that families indicated needing. A number of families mentioned that they had participated in services through Head Start, which I mentioned before, including some family support services and parenting classes. Many noted that they hadn't participated more recently in those kinds of activities because of the pandemic. But a lot of the conversation around what's needed is information about these types of programs. I mean, I think there are broad programs and services available to families, but what we heard a lot is that there's not a single or information source that parents can go to find out what is available to them. So suggestions we heard, like Mommy and Me programs, again, better supports for moms in terms of moms and dads for trying to learn English. And again, these updated community resource lists so that families can sort of at their fingertips identify different resources within their communities that they could utilize. Okay, so when we think about considerations for strategic planning, improving communication strategies to provide families with information, again, about the services available to them, improving ease of access to programs by reducing some of the administrative burden for particularly vulnerable families or dual language learners, families experiencing homelessness, or those living in rural areas. So trying to think of ways that we could reduce some of the burden to access for families. Also, we heard a lot about expanding access to home visiting programs, and then collecting data on those home visiting models, so that we could streamline those services and better understand the availability, as well as what some of the barriers to access might be, and disaggregating those by race and ethnicity and income. And I think with that, I'll stop there so that we have just a few more minutes at the end, and pass it back to Emily, I think, or Dan for the conclusions.
I think I'm gonna jump in here, Nicole, with just sort of a high level look at the conclusions overall. I will flag for you in just a minute. We'll take, as Nicole mentioned, the last couple minutes of our time together to respond to questions in the chat. I do want to flag, as you're thinking of questions, that our team at the Hunt Institute and also at Duke are serving in this capacity as vendors, basically in this case, to the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. And so, we can't speak on behalf of the state in terms of next steps or how the agency is going to invest resources. And I just wanted to flag that in terms of your questions to understand sort of probably what appropriately we can answer. And that really is questions around the needs assessment update process, the data, who we spoke to, what we learned, the questions around sort of what will happen next or how the state is going to use this data are probably best left to another conversation with the agency itself. So let me jump into the conclusions here. And one thing that is not on the slide, but that I would just flag as a high level finding, and probably no secret to any of you, is that what you have just heard is sort of through a North Carolina lens, a lot of what's happened in the country over the past couple of years. The challenges that we have unpacked certainly are important to North Carolina, but not of North Carolina's making in many cases, or exclusive to North Carolina. And in fact, there are a lot of the same challenges that we at the Hunt Institute are seeing as we are working with early childhood leaders all across the country. So I think that's important context. In terms of our conclusions slide here, certainly saw that increased coordination and collaboration between the agencies, between organizations, have definitely helped to support alignment and systems building in the early care and learning network in the state. I can tell you, having worked in many states, how blessed North Carolina really is to have so many engaged, active stakeholders, both individually and organizationally. And it is clear that the collaboration and coordination across the system is a strength for North Carolina. We know also that input from providers and families is really crucial in developing an early care and learning network that is accessible and beneficial for all children. It's interesting that our colleagues at the Bipartisan Policy Center here just in the past couple of weeks issued a fascinating report that I would call to your attention about the illusion of parental choice, for example, when it comes to childcare. And it really gets into a lot of the conversation, that we have just had and have had over the past year, that, the needs of families may well not align with some of the service offerings that families need. In some cases, nighttime care or weekend care or sort of off hours, depending on their employment. And so it is really important, as one conclusion, that the state continue this ongoing process of sort of exploring and regularly updating a needs assessment, and gathering that feedback, hearing directly from providers and hearing directly from families about their needs. This next one is a great example of what I was talking about, sort of the national challenge here, but no question that low wages and lack of benefits for the early childhood workforce threaten the overall viability of the industry. There are long-term strategies, including public investment and building early educator pathways that can help us to ensure that this is a viable career path. But ultimately, compensation does matter in the field, and is something that North Carolina, like all states, will need to continue looking at and focusing on. You may know that the median child care wage in the country right now is $13.22 an hour. Particularly here as the pandemic has sort of tightened the labor market, we have seen fast food restaurants and we have seen big box stores, for example, that have had to up their starting wages simply to get employees in the door, which is easier said than done in the childcare market because of the kind of unique financial model that childcare operates under. So certainly compensation bubbles up to the top as a major theme here. Increased access to high quality early care and learning is needed, and it is especially needed for children with disabilities who may have difficulty accessing it, for families of color, for families with tribal affiliations, families living in rural areas, and families with infant toddlers. Infant toddler care certainly in short supply in North Carolina, and again, all across the nation. It is important as well that we keep current data on the early care and learning workforce. We talked about their compensation needs, but also data on the workforce itself and on the services that children and families are accessing. And it is important that we disaggregate this data by race and ethnicity, and see this as really necessary to continue improvements in the network. It is possible, and we have worked with data in many states where it is possible to see sort of an upward trend where things in general may be looking even pretty good in some cases, but then you disaggregate that data and you find that it's not working nearly as well for all children. And so it's important that we continue to break down that data and look at special populations and make sure that we are advancing the ball for all children in the state. So definitely that is a recommendation to the state on an ongoing basis. We know, and we've talked about this today, that behavioral supports and mental health needs have definitely increased for young children in recent years. In fact, have also increased for older children and for families and for adults. But we know, particularly coming out of these years of sort of isolation, and in some cases that the behavioral and mental health needs of young children will require additional supports, and that it is not not sufficient to simply sort of shift that onto teachers. It's important that there are supports to the children and to families, but also supports to classroom staff who may not be initially well prepared to deal with some of those challenges. And so the more we can support those needs, the better. Finally, it is important that families, and this is actually a really interesting one. We find that families take a comprehensive lens on child development. that they are considering social and emotional development along with academic skills. I've often said, if we stopped 10 people walking down the street and asked them what their perception of sort of what it takes to be successful as a rising kindergartner, for example, that they may quickly shift into those sorts of basic academic skills, knowledge of the alphabet and counting, for example, whereas teachers really understand and tend to prioritize the social emotional development. But it was fascinating to see in this study how well families really did take a comprehensive lens. They didn't focus only on those academic skills, and really expressed a lot of concern throughout the pandemic, in particular, about the social and emotional impact of the isolation that maybe they were experiencing, and the absence of a classroom experience and a chance to interact with peers. So important that we continue to increase family engagement and continue to look at the aim of serving children holistically. We've got just a couple of minutes here. I'm going to jump into the questions, but I'm going to group a couple of them together. Nicole and Liz, there are a couple of questions here about what I will call sort of more informal aspects of care, whether they are programs that operate for a limited number of hours and therefore aren't subject to the same regulatory requirements as a full-fledged center-based childcare program, or family childcare, which may be operating a little bit on the margins and the sort of gray market, if you will, that may not be licensed and registered with the state. Did we have any luck in terms of reaching out or getting data on those more informal types of care?
We did not. So part of the structure of this particular component of the needs assessment update was to focus on licensed care only. However, for the additional work we're doing with family child care homes, there would be an opportunity to reach out to find providers who may have been licensed but left the licensed field during the pandemic or even before, and what supports might be needed to bring them back in. So a deeper dive there that could include those folks.
Right. Daphne is asking a question about the North Carolina McVie needs assessment and whether we found any common threads. I don't know if that's a question that any of our panel is prepared to answer.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think could be a neat opportunity to crosswalk those two things. I was not aware of that needs assessment, but perhaps in partnership with the state, a crosswalk could be done.
We did use some of the data from that needs assessment with some of the data points in the updated needs assessment to compare to our focus group responses, especially about the need for increased home visiting. And for families that were using home visiting, we used those data points to correlate with those focus group responses. So we did use some of that in the needs assessment update.
Let's see, I am looking through here, and again, I want to flag that we're going to bypass questions today that are probably more appropriately responded to by DHHS than the needs assessment team. Ramona asks an important question: where can I get a copy of the Frank Porter Graham report released in 2020? I believe that is on the DCDE website. But we can try to track that down. I will here before we close down the webinar here, try to plug into the chat one more time. In fact, here as we're discussing, I'm going to go ahead and grab those links and insert again for you a link to the actual needs assessment document itself, which I'm going to drop directly here into the chat. There is an English version and a Spanish version that is available for access on the DHHS website. I've just added the English version, and I'm going to drop the Spanish version right now. And so if you'd like to go take a look at those. Encourage you to grab these links here quickly as we are winding down the hour. Want to take a moment again to thank, first off, all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. This was a fascinating project for us to work on, and I think really speaks, in the long term, to the need for this sort of analysis on an ongoing basis. I think, COVID is probably a very extreme example of how the world can shift in a relatively short period of time. But definitely sort of looking at where the state was in February of 2020 versus where we are here as we release this information in May of 2023. Not a terribly long period of time in the grand scheme of things, but definitely a major shift. And so I would hope for all of our sakes that we don't see these types of abrupt shifts in the landscape here in the years to come, but definitely a good lesson for all of us that we need to be collecting this data and looking at it on an ongoing basis to inform the needs of the state. It has been a real honor, I know, for the center and also for the Hunt Institute to be able to be involved in this work, and we are grateful again for you taking time out today to join us. Thanks so much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.